So the topic is the best format for your resume for job applications. Okay, I'm going to lay some principles on you. I'm going to lay 8 principles on you about resumes. These are the guiding principles that basically inform you what's going on and what you should do, according to me. The gospel according to me. Okay, so let's get this out of the way. There's something that I've done many times. I'm going to do it again just as a starting point. I'm going to do a screen share, and I'm going to show you something very, very simple, elementary, that you can do as a starting point. Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so resume examples. Okay, you know what? You could do it in Google, but I'm going to do this in Bing. Actually, I'm going to do this properly here. Let's get Bing going. I do prefer to use Bing for certain searches, and this is one of them. Okay, so bing.com. Right, it's got that lovely name for the hint of professionalism. So go to images, and we're going to type in resume examples. And this is what you get. Okay, you get a ton of resumes, and what you can do is you can do this. You can just sort of scroll through them like this. Okay, now to take it to the next level, you can also type in the name of a position, a job. Okay, so if you're going to be a project manager or something like that, you can look at resumes that are, in theory, a little more tailored to the project manager role. Okay, and just get a feel for some of the things that different people do. Okay, so you can see the extreme range of possibilities that there are out there for doing a resume. Okay, I'm not saying that every single one of these resumes is the way to go, but you can get an idea for the broad scope of what's possible here and what's done. And the first thing that you take away from this is that resumes vary quite a bit. There's a lot of different styles. There's a lot of different types of things people put on their resumes. Let's start narrowing it down. Okay, so let's start with the basics here. A lot of times, people assume that a resume is like a trophy. It's like a list of your accomplishments, the things of which you're most proud. That's how a lot of people regard their resumes. This is incorrect. Okay, if that's the way you look at your resume, you probably are not getting a lot of responses to the job applications you send out. And the reason is because you're misunderstanding what a resume is. It's not a sort of trophy of all your accomplishments and experiences and education of which you're the most proud. It's a marketing document. It's something you use for a specific purpose that gets a result. It's something you use to apply for a job, and its sole purpose is to get you the interview. Okay? That's what the resume is. Now, in order for that to be effective, your resume is not a static document that just stays the same for every job that you apply to. That will not be very effective. If you keep your resume frozen and just keep using it and sending it out all the time for different jobs, chances are it's not going to get a lot of responses. The resume should be tailored to the jobs that you apply for. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that, like, well, if I apply for 1,000 jobs in a day, which is possible, how can I tailor my resume for each one? That's way too labor intensive. It's way too time consuming. It's not practical. Well, here's the deal. You shouldn't be applying for 1,000 jobs in a day, in my opinion. Instead, you should be applying for less jobs, but you should be doing a much better quality application, because in the end, you will get more interviews by following that approach. Okay? So everyone needs to understand your resume is a document. Its sole purpose is to get you the interview. And in order to do that, it needs to be flexible. It needs to change depending on what job you're applying for. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. It's a marketing document. It's not sort of a trophy laundry list of your accomplishments to fuel your ego and self-worth. You can certainly make one of those, okay? And that's fine. But what you send out to apply for a job, it should be about what the recruiter cares about and not necessarily about what you care about that matters, because you're trying to convince them, not you. Okay, let's start with the basics. What is going to change on your resume depending on what job you apply for? Well, the first thing is going to be the lingo. So if you apply for one job where they use specific terms, right? Let's say they use the term frontline manager. Okay, that's what was in the job description. And maybe that's the title of the role that you're applying for, frontline manager, right? You would want to make sure that your resume contains the term frontline manager, so that if you have experience as a frontline manager, it says frontline manager. It doesn't say supervisor. It doesn't say, lead hand or any other equivalent term. It says frontline manager, right? Now, this is important if your resume is going to go through an ATS system where they do searches for keywords. It's also important if your resume is going to be read by a human, okay? Because if it's read by a recruiter, and some recruiters are pretty awesome at their jobs, but a lot of others aren't. And I think sometimes people give recruiters a little too much credit. Recruiters often don't understand really anything about the jobs that they're trying to fill. They've been given the job, and they've been given the role, the job assignment, and their function is to fill that role with a candidate, to find candidates that are qualified for that role. And they themselves don't know what a frontline manager is. They've never worked as a frontline manager. They don't really understand what skills or experiences are important to be a frontline manager, right? But when they get a resume from you that doesn't have the words frontline manager anywhere in it, that's going to give them the impression that you're just not qualified. You've never done this job. You don't know anything about this job. You have no experience that's related to this job. So they reject your application, which is a shame because they've come to the completely incorrect conclusion. You are quite qualified. It's just that you were calling that term supervisor, and you've worked as a supervisor for 20 years, and you have a lot of experience and accomplishments as a supervisor. The only problem was you didn't use the term frontline manager, and they weren't even aware that frontline manager and supervisor mean the same thing in the context in which you wrote it. Okay, so at the very basic level, you've got to change the lingo so that it matches what they put in their job description and that they're looking for. Okay, that's the first thing you got to put in there. Okay, you got to customize your resume so it includes their lingo. Okay, now the other thing about your resume is that your resume is kind of like, I hate the word branding sometimes because I think people use that word all the time. They use it for things that they shouldn't be. But essentially, your resume is going to be a part of your branding. It states your identity, who you are, right? So if my job title was, let's say I was a supervisor, okay? And I was applying for a role as supervisor in a company, what would be good is if I sent a resume and it had my name at the top, and then under my name it had some kind of tagline that says who I am. So I could say, I'm Bill Todd. I'm a supervisor. I'm a supervisor in this context. A manufacturing plant where we produce plastic injection molding, right? Something like that. We do plastic injection molding and we make plastic parts. So that's who I am. I'm a supervisor of injection molding processes in plastics manufacturing. That's my tagline. You see, that tells people who I am. It tells the recruiter who I am, right? So a tagline is very important. It's like a term. At the very longest, it could even be almost a sentence, but it's basically a few words. Now, sometimes you get people that expand the tagline into like a paragraph, and they call that different things. They call it, like, I think, a career profile, or I forget the terminology, but they can call it various things. But you could say, I'm a injection molding professional. I have 20 years in experience in a supervisory role, supervising employees that work in this particular process. I myself am an expert on this process. And I've made process improvements in a variety of applications to, doing injection molding, something like that. Okay, so it's longer than a tagline. It's almost like a paragraph. You're describing who you are, right? And that goes right at the top of your resume. And the thing is, what you've got to understand is that when you send out a resume, if it does go to a human, okay, if a human ends up looking at it, like presumably a recruiter, they're not going to read it in its entirety. They're going to spend a handful of seconds looking at your resume. And so the essentials, what you want them to know, have to be obvious when someone only has a few seconds to look at your resume. Okay? So this is the other important thing. This is a very important concept. People are not going to read your resume in depth unless they've shortlisted you for an interview, usually. And even then, they don't really read a lot of it in depth. I don't think a lot of recruiters even read your resume comprehensively, period. That's just been my experience. Yes, so that's another important concept. You have to draw out the essentials and make them very obvious. Okay, so I'm going to enumerate these for you here. I'd written these out. I'm going to enumerate them. So number one is that you can do a Bing search or even a Google search, do an image search, find examples of resumes, see the range of different things that are out there. Number two, understanding that your resume is a marketing document. Its sole purpose is to get you an interview for that specific job that you've applied for. Okay. That means it has to change. It has to be adapted to the recipient, to what they're looking for. Number three, at a basic level, you have to make sure the lingo matches. So that's something that's going to vary depending on what job you're applying for. You have to use their terms so that they recognize the things that they're looking for on your resume. Okay, and thus come to the conclusion that you're qualified. Number four, your resume, it has to be sort of you at a glance. It has to be your branding tool. And I would say within 10 seconds, they have to be sold on the fact that you're qualified for the job. So all the things that they were looking for in the job description under requirements, they said, we're looking for someone who has this. That has to pop out at them in the first 10 seconds. Now, one of the things that I did many years ago, I don't know if I necessarily recommend this across the board, but I did this, is that I would highlight certain things on my resume. That was one way to make certain things jump out, right? If your resume is like a blank page and you have like 4 things highlighted on it, those tend to jump out. You can't highlight like every second word, but you can highlight maybe 4 or 5 things on a page. And that can sometimes help. That will not help an ATS system to find those keywords, but you shouldn't need to do it in that situation. It will help with a human. Okay. So that's what we've covered so far. Okay. I talked briefly about your tagline. Tagline is who you are. So if you're introducing yourself, what do you say? You'd say, hello, I'm Bill Todd, I'm a student. Or you'd say, hello, I'm Bill Todd, I'm a professional engineer. Or you'd say, hello, I'm Bill Todd, I'm a former CEO. Or you would say, hello, I'm Bill Todd, I'm a World War II enthusiast. It's how you're choosing to identify yourself to the person that you're meeting. Your resume's got to do that. That's what a tagline is. So you have your name and you say who you are. And if they're looking for a supervisor, if assuming this is true, you would probably want to say something like, hello, I'm Bill Todd, supervisor with 20 years experience in this particular area, something like that. And that's how you identify. So already they're hearing things that they're liking, that they're looking for. Okay. I've heard it said that, if you are really good at this, you can sell yourself entirely with the sort of name, tagline, and what you would term as like a career profile or career summary. Like, this is who you are, where you explain it in a couple of sentences. That assumes, of course, that part of your resume is prominent enough that people will read it, right? No harm in shooting for that. That would be the ideal, but I think that it's a lot easier to get people to like look at individual words popping out rather than like a paragraph at the top popping out. But that's just me. Okay. So that was point number 5. If you can try and sell someone with your summary at the top, that would be ideal. The next point, number 6 that I want to make is to do with how you present yourself. If you describe your duties, like what you do, I do this, I use this software, I complete this process, I work at this job, that in itself doesn't sell you. The reaction of the other person is, why should I care? If you say that to a recruiter, they're looking at different applicants, and then now they're looking at you, and they come to you and you say, well, I do this and I do that. I perform these duties. I have these responsibilities. The reaction from a recruiter is usually going to be, who cares? Okay. Because you're talking about yourself. What I want to do is, what can you do for me? What can you do for this company? Why would we want to hire you? Okay, this is about us. Why would we want to hire you? What can you do for us, right? So instead of phrasing like, these are the duties that I have and this is what I do, instead, as a general rule, you want to phrase your statements as, this is what results I get. This is what I can do for you. Okay? So if you say instead of, I do this process or I complete these forms, instead you say, I make sure that this process is done very efficiently. I make sure that when I work in customer service or something, I make sure that the levels of customer service satisfaction are among the best in the industry. Something like that. You're talking about the results you get rather than the things you do, rather than the actions you perform. Does that make sense? You want to talk about results and not tasks. That's kind of a general way to express your value to another party. Okay, so that applies in your resume. So instead of saying, I do this, I take these forms, I process them, I fill out time cards, I answer phones. Instead, you talk about what are the results that you get when you do that. I make sure that, customers are always happy. I make sure that, public inquiries get routed promptly and accurately to the person that can answer their questions. I make sure that, our mistake rates or our defect rates for this particular process are, below 5%, whatever it is, right? So that's what I recommend that people learn that principle, okay? That's point number 6. I guess did I get rid of my window? I think I did, didn't I? Anyway, when I had the screen up, when we were doing the Bing search and we were going through all the different resumes, you guys might have noticed some of the resumes that scrolled by. You got different types of resumes. You got the chronological resume, And then you got the functional resume. There's two kind of types of resumes. There two basic types. There are others, like there's a hybrid resume, which is like, you know, a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. But basically, you got those two types of resumes. The chronological resumes, that's where you list all your work experience. So you say, I started here, I did this, then I worked here, you know, with these dates, and then I worked here, you know, with these dates, then I worked here with these dates, right? That's a chronological resume. The vast majority of the resumes you're going to see are going to be some variant of the chronological resume. There's also the functional resume. Functional resume, that's where there's no dates. It's not about what jobs you've done. It's about who you are and what can you do. Now, that resume format is more appropriate for if you're at middle management level and up, okay? Not super, you know, tailored to lower level jobs. They're also really good for if the person already knows you. It's sort of a summary of you. Here's what I do. These are the results I get. Here's how I do it. Here's the approach I take. And, you know, this is who I am. You know, that's more useful at higher circles. So what I'd recommend for most people, especially if at your lower level, worker level, is some form of chronological resume. And the kind that we, or at least I most often see, are technically reverse chronological format. So you start out with your most recent experience, the newest job you've had, latest job, maybe your current job, and then you go further into the past as you go down. Before that, I did this. Before that, I did that. Before that, I did that, right? That's the reverse chronological format. That's pretty much what my recommendation would be. You can do something called a hybrid resume, which is basically what I just described, a reverse chronological resume, but at the top, maybe the first quarter of the first page or the first half of the first page, there's a little section that sort of summarizes you. That's where you have your tagline and your career summary and things like this. You can get away with that, but you have to tailor it. You have to tailor it to the job that you're applying for. Okay, so basically I recommend a reverse chronological format. So you start with your experience and then you have your education right at the end. 2-page resume. No 3-page resumes. Sometimes you can get away with 1 page, but basically most people are going to have a 2-page resume. If you're just coming out of school, you know, like you haven't really had a career job in your life, like I guess a 1-page resume, you can get away with it. But try and fill it out. Try and have it like be a page and a half. You can talk about some of the activity you've done in your education, like some of the group work, maybe some research you had to do, or, you know, particular skills in particular areas, you know, things like this, that might be helpful. But the vast majority of people are going to have a 2-page resume. Okay. I'm just trying to think what else there's some things that, you know, people make a big deal about not putting certain things on the resume or putting certain things, like saying, you know, references available on request, you know, things like that. It's not the end of the world, but that doesn't really add a lot of value. The standard for many years was if you had a Myers-Briggs type indicator, to put that on there. 5 years ago, that was a non-issue. You would have that on there if you had it. It doesn't really help that much, but it doesn't really hurt. Some people are into it, some people aren't. Nowadays, we're sort of going away from that slowly. I don't know if that's really fallen from favor yet, but if you have it on there, for me personally, I'm interested to see, because that does tell you something about the person. It's not this be-all, end-all that they seem to want it to make it, and then got upset when it wasn't. But it tells you some basic stuff about the person. But the bottom line is that you don't want a bunch of stuff on there that has nothing directly to do with the job that you're applying for. This is if you're going through a recruiter. You don't want a bunch of things that are like, you know, unrelated to the job you're applying for. If you're dealing with a hiring manager, it's not the end of the world, but specifically if it's a recruiter, they start to see it as a negative if you have a lot of things on there that aren't directly related to the job in question. Okay? Because the way they think is that what they're looking for is they're wanting to find someone who is specialized for that role. And the more things you have on your resume where they're jobs other than something directly related to the one you're applying for, is each one counts as a negative. You lose points for each one because it then looks like you're more of a generalist, and there's a bunch of silly conclusions they derive from that, like, you're not specialized in it. So just be aware of that. If you've got a lot of stuff like that, I would actually take some of those off your resume if you're applying for a specific job. It feels really bad doing that. It feels like a part of you dies each time. A little piece of you dies because you're proud of that experience and you know that it's valuable. You've learned a lot of things. And I agree. But the problem is that recruiters are trained to view that as a lack of focus, and it dilutes the skills that you actually do have that are directly related. Okay. And we've talked about hybrid resumes. They're best for middle management and up and executives. So most people are not really going to be doing those. And they're not really good for ATS either, like for what that's worth. People on ATS, they look for keywords. They look for, terms, like dates, years of experience. Recruiters love to use years of experience as some kind of metric for how good of an employee you are. We all know that that is crap, but the industry norm is for them to think like this. So, you know what I mean? So unfortunately, to be successful at their game, you have to play by their rules and include that. Okay. So that's 8 points I've made. Number 7 was the reverse chronological format. And number 8 was that hybrid resumes are only really useful for mid-level management and up. Okay, so that's 8 principles that will guide you in doing a resume that will accomplish its goal, which is for you to get called in to an interview for that particular role. That's the sole purpose of the resume. And you do it by giving the decision maker, usually a recruiter, what they're looking for. And what they're looking for is they want to see the requirements that they listed in the job description. They want to see those, the exact words on your resume, describing your experiences, describing what you know how to do, and describing who you are. Okay? So by definition, that means you have to tailor your resume to every job that you apply for if you're taking it seriously. And I would recommend you only apply for jobs that you take seriously and do this. Because just firing a generic resume out to like 1,000 jobs will not produce a lot of bites. Okay? And for those of you that have done this, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? And that's what I have to say about resumes.